Welcome, everyone. I am Indy Burke. I'm the Dean of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and we just feel really lucky to be able to host these events here. I want to thank the organizing group of the Terry Interdisciplinary Lectureships. They've just done a fantastic job by bringing us Tom Lovejoy, who's a great friend of the school and has been giving some great presentations earlier, culminating today. But my job is not to introduce Tom. My job is to introduce the introducer. So these are complicated lectureships, but we sort of embody interdisciplinarity tonight. I am, by training, a biogeochemist, and I am introducing Dr. Paul Sabin, who's a historian, environmental historian. He directs the Yale Environmental Humanities Initiative here. He is also a great friend of our school. He's written an award-winning book called The Bet. And let's welcome Paul Sabin.
Well, I hope my introduction lives up to being introduced. That's a high bar. So I am here, I guess, as representing the history department and the Yale Environmental Humanities Initiative, which is a new initiative the last couple of years, and we've been trying to gather up people from across the campus who are working on the environment and the humanities, and trying to connect them and share their work together. And one of the activities that I think is characteristic of the environmental humanities is the effort to try to bring together the sciences with the humanities and to think about the broader interdisciplinary framework for thinking about environmental problems. And so that's why it's one reason why it's a particular pleasure to to be part of hosting Tom Lovejoy's talks, and because in seeing a scientist thinking broadly about ethics and about society and about how we should be taking into account and thinking about our future, given the dire predictions that are being circulated daily, it seems, even just in the last 2 weeks, both about about wildlife populations and the heating of the oceans and other things. So just briefly, for those of you who haven't been at the previous lectures, to introduce Dr. Lovejoy, for the past 30 years, he's been working on the intersection between climate change and biodiversity. He received his Bachelor of Science and also his doctorate in biology from here at Yale. And starting in the 70s, he was leading in bringing attention to the issue of tropical deforestation, particularly in the Amazon. So I remember growing up in the 80s hearing about deforestation in the Amazon, and I think I was benefiting from his work at that time. He's been working in the Amazon since 1965. In 1980, he was involved with the Global 2000 report to the president, projecting global extinctions. Some of the similar research that just was coming out this week, I think it was from World Wildlife Fund, right? And at that time was involved in coining the term for biological diversity. He's got two co-edited books that were published in 1992 and 2005 that help that credit him with helping to found the field of climate change biology. And one of the things I think is distinctive about Dr. Lovejoy is that he is the way that he has married science with conservation and practice and a form of global activism, I would say, towards conservation. And one of the ways in which he's done that is his involvement in developing the Debt for Nature swap programs to try to find ways to generate funds to protect nature, natural ecosystems, and his work in leading the minimum critical size of ecosystems project. And he's been recognized widely for his work. In 2001, he received the prestigious Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement. In 2009, he was the winner of the BBVA Foundation Frontiers of Knowledge Award for Ecology and Conservation Biology, and also has been appointed the Conservation Fellow by National Geographic, and more recently has returned to academia, where he's been teaching and doing research. George Mason as a university professor, which he in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy, and he took that role on starting in 2010. So as I mentioned, I guess I actually just met Tom Lovejoy for the first time just a few minutes ago, but I feel like I've been hearing about him since when I was an undergraduate here at Yale in the 1980s into the early 1990s, and so I feel that I know him as a champion of the environment, and of conservation, and as part of really a Yale tradition of environmental leaders and a steward of the environmental programs here at Yale, and someone who I know as being a broad-minded person, not just narrowly focused on biology, but concerned with the humanities and public affairs as well. And I think in that sense, a model environmental leader to come out of the Yale programs. Delighted to welcome you again for your third Terry lecture, and invite you to come up, and there will be time for questions afterwards.
Okay, good. So last week, we began by sort of exploring value systems, religious perspectives about life on Earth, and how humanity might fit with all of that, and in essence, how to embed human aspiration in nature. Tuesday, we looked at our widespread practice of fragmenting nature, leaving fragments all over the place, losing species, and then began to look about ways you could start stitching these fragments back together again. What I want to do in the final lecture is look at this issue of biodiversity and climate change. And let's start by looking at biodiversity and climate change. This is a peregrine falcon on Central Park West, looking down at the climate march before the UN General Assembly about 3 years ago. And on the 9th of January, the third book on biodiversity and climate change will publish. Thanks again to Yale University Press. And it's really very interesting to compare the three books. In the first, appearing in 1992, all you could really do is look at what had happened in the geologic past and try to imagine how some of that might apply to the future. By the time of the second, you could see the fingerprints of climate change all over the place. And by the time this one is out, it has become very obvious that biologically we need to limit climate change to no more than 1.5 degrees. And that's one of the messages I hope to convey this afternoon. So I'm not going to get into the physical changes, ice to non-ice, sea level rise. I'm going to pretty quickly, after introducing this amazing Swedish scientist, get into the biology of all of this, what's happening to it, and then ultimately how biology actually gives us an important way to create a much more hopeful future than the current trajectory would lead us to. So I always like to get into this topic by not pretending to be an expert on climate change. I'm not an expert on climate change. I'm an expert, if there is such a thing, on how climate change and the biodiversity of the planet interact. But I find it useful to start with Arrhenius by explaining that when he wrote a very famous paper in 1896, that he was really trying to answer the question, why is the planet a habitable temperature for humans and other forms of life? Why isn't it too cold? And the answer, of course, was the natural level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, most notably carbon dioxide. And he actually calculated with pencil and paper what doubling pre-industrial levels of CO2 would do to the average temperature of the Earth. And it came out precisely where the fancy supercomputer models provide it today. not the detail, of course. And in addition, he would not have been particularly aware of the actual climatic history of the Earth in the preceding tens and hundreds of thousands of years, as we can see here, nor that last 10,000 years on the upper right, a period of unusual stability in the climatic system, which includes all recorded human history, a significant amount of unrecorded human history, the origins of agriculture, the origin of human settlements. And basically, you have to conclude that the entire human enterprise is actually based on the assumption of a stable climate. And that, of course, we're changing. And I won't take you through a lot of details of that. I'm going to go straight to the kinds of changes that are being observed in nature. So, in many parts of the world, in this particular case, the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, various species of plants are flowering earlier every year, where there are long data sets, like at the famous Leopold shack, continued after his death by his daughter Nina. You can see the same pattern of earlier flowering times. And it's not just plants that are responding, it's also animals. So tree swallows are migrating earlier, nesting earlier, laying eggs earlier. Even a couple birds have ceased to migrate. And we are seeing organisms change where they actually occur geographically. So this is one of the two best-known species of butterflies in North America, called the Edis checker spot. And very distinctly, you can see it has been moving northward and upward in altitude in response to changing climate, basically tracking its required conditions. Also in California, the Joshua tree is now growing outside of Joshua Tree National Park because of climate change. And these kinds of changes are occurring not only on the land, they're occurring in the water, they're occurring in the oceans. And if anything, those changes seem to be happening faster in ocean organisms, maybe because so many of them actually are not rooted in any sense, and their medium is fluid. So in the Chesapeake Bay, the great estuary on the eastern coast of South America, one of the really important communities from an economic point of view, but also a biodiversity point of view, is the eelgrass community. And they turn out to be very sensitive to water temperature. So as it has been warming, the southern boundary of the eelgrass community has been marching north year after year. And the changes we're seeing are not just in the temperate zone or the boreal zone. We're also seeing changes in the tropics. There may be less often about temperature than about changes in moisture patterns. Here we're looking at the legendary cloud forest of Monteverde, Costa Rica, an ecosystem that depends essentially 98% on condensation from clouds as the source of its moisture. And what has been happening there is clouds have been forming less frequently at the altitude of Monteverde and forming higher, creating more dry days every year. Not something very good for a cloud-dependent ecosystem. And we have a plethora of examples, or what are called decoupling events, when two features in nature which are tightly linked in timing turn out to use different mechanisms for that timing, one using day length and the other using temperature. And so they decouple. And in this particular instance, the snow that would normally provide cover for snowshoe hares in their white winter pelage is no longer there as long into the spring. And that's a very tough thing for snowshoe hares because their ability to change the timing of of their change in fur from winter pelage to summer pelage is very inelastic. It is, in fact, very day length dependent, and so you get lots of instances of bright snowshoe hare rabbits basically sitting ducks on non-white backgrounds. So this particular slide, I always point out I would penalize any student for because it's utterly unreadable. But it's to make the point that what I've been telling you is not a collection of isolated anecdotes. It's now statistically robust that nature is responding to climate change almost anywhere in the world you look. So those are basically minor ripples in the fabric of life. The real issue is, what does it look like looking ahead? And one of the things one can do to get a sense of what might take place is to look at the climatic conditions that a particular community, particularly in this case a sugar maple, normally lives within, and then you can project where that climatic envelope will occur at, say, double pre-industrial levels of CO2. And the bad news on this is that anything that you love sugar maples for, from autumn foliage to maple sugar at double pre-industrial levels, you're going to have to go to Canada. And all the great complex computer models come out with that conclusion. So this image is here to make the point that the two physical parameters most important for terrestrial organisms are temperature and moisture, and for aquatic ones, temperature and acidity, or pH. And all of those are changing. Freshwater species like trout, which are very dependent on cold water, are particularly vulnerable. And so are species that live in high places, like this charming rabbit relative called the pika, which lives in isolated colonies in the Rocky Mountains. And what happens with these kinds of species is they move upward in altitude, tracking their required conditions until there is no further up to go. And at least one of these colonies has already winked out. Any species that basically lives near the coast is going to have to cope with sea level rise. Some will do better than others. Yesterday, I had the treat to go to Hammonasset, where I hadn't been since freshman year. And one of the characteristic birds there is this salt marsh sparrow, which has a really specialized biology. And it basically has to complete its nesting cycle between two spring tides, get it all done sufficiently in 2.5 weeks that the young can survive some experience with salt water. And the salt marsh sparrow habitat is not advancing as quickly as the sea level rise, so they're getting a serious squeeze. Another interesting thing to do is think about what sea level rise means for the Everglades, the famous river of grass. And basically, all of that is seriously vulnerable already to saltwater intrusion. It will respond in various ways, but certain organisms, like the American alligator, are going to be suddenly at a disadvantage compared to the American crocodile, because there's going to be more salt in their habitat, and the crocodile is actually physiologically capable of excreting salt. So I think we can look forward to a Florida with more crocodiles and fewer alligators. Any organism on islands, especially low-lying islands like the Florida Keys, is basically in deep trouble. The key deer simply won't survive unless they're transplanted somewhere else. And even species on islands that aren't low will have serious problems because the climatic conditions on the island will actually change, and there's no way that the organisms that live there really can follow them. And of course, there are a whole suite of organisms that basically have a natural history that related to ice, and the polar bear, of course, is the poster child for that. Those are sort of the broad brush ways of looking at it going ahead. But there are serious complications. And the first of these, which we examined last week, our propensity in sort of an insouciant fashion to fragment natural habitats, basically makes it tremendously difficult for the organisms in those habitats to be able to move and track their required climatic conditions. Basically, we've created an obstacle course. And that actually is one of the easiest complications to do something about, because as we explored last week, there are lots of good reasons to put natural connections back into the landscape. And when you do that, it's much easier for the organisms to track the conditions they require. The second complication is a much tougher one, and it's involved in the conclusion that I will get to in a little bit, that we really do need to stop climate change at 1.5 degrees. And that is simply, we know that in the past, that entire biological communities don't move as a unit. It's the individual organisms and species that move. And so basically, it becomes something that's very hard to manage. And here's what happened after the last glacier retreated in Europe. And we're looking, if I remember correctly, at 3 mammal species, 2 tree species, and insect species. There is no common pattern of their response to the change in climate. So that's something that's really hard to do anything about, and why it's really important to try and limit the amount of climate change so that we don't actually have to cope with natural habitats that are coming apart in very fluid and unpredictable ways. Third reason to worry about more climate change, greater climate change, is we know, even though our computer models are linear and gradual, that the environment doesn't actually work that way. We know, for example, that the climate system has abrupt changes built into it in the past, one of them involving this incredible current called the global conveyor belt, which moves warmth around the globe, coming from the Pacific and the Indian Ocean and up the Atlantic until finally it cools between Greenland and Europe and sinks down. That's why Europe basically has a habitable climate. And it's been known to shut down in geologic time. And the probable mechanism for that is actually copious amounts of fresh water from melting glacial ice, sort of cutting off that actual sinking action. But even before something like that, and nobody can give you any prediction when something like that might happen, we are seeing abrupt changes in ecosystems. And one of the most dramatic is here in North America. It involves the coniferous forests of Western North America. And basically what's happening there is that the warming climate has tipped the balance in favor of the native bark beetles. So in this video of British Columbia, at the beginning, you just may be able to detect a little red pinpricks of beetle outbreaks. But as time goes on, and the winters are warmer, and more beetles survive the winter, and they get in another generation. Suddenly, this tips the balance in favor of the beetles, and even when we get shortly here to 1985, when there was a cold winter, and they were beaten back, they weren't beaten back that much. And the consequence is that there are large areas of western North America, from southern Alaska down to southern Colorado, where there is massive coniferous tree mortality. And nobody, I think, really can tell you what's going to happen to those forests. It's sort of unprecedented. A similar kind of abrupt change is already occurring in tropical coral reefs, which all look like this when I was an undergraduate and a graduate student. These incredible technicolor, highly diverse, highly productive communities, enormously important to the 5% of humanity that live within 100 meters of coral reefs. And it turns out the very partnership on which the tropical coral reef is built, the relationship between the coral animal and the alga, is very sensitive, in particular to temperature change. Not very long and not that much warmer, and the coral animal ejects the alga, and the entire ecosystem collapses and basically goes from technicolor to black and white, and everything that a tropical coral reef was about in a healthy state basically collapses. That was first noticed in 1983. Last year, more than half of the Great Barrier Reef of Australia had a bleaching event. And looking ahead into their coming summer and the weather projections, we could well see the entire Great Barrier Reef have a bleaching event. And they can come back from those events, but not repeatedly. More recently, we had an example on the front page of the New York Times about the great kelp forests in the Pacific off the western coast of North America. And it's another one of these idiosyncratic relationships. In this case, there is a native urchin, the purple urchin, and warming waters have allowed its numbers to explode to the point that basically they've eaten down those forests to the point that they're, basically not kelp forests anymore. So I think what we're finding is you can do elegant climatic models. You can do elegant vegetation models. But the way the systems are going to react in the end will come down to idiosyncratic relationships between particular species within them. And then, lastly, there's some changes going on that are at an even bigger scale. I call them system change. And one of them involves my favorite place in the world, the Amazon. And here you see how moisture is generated hour by hour. And it's mostly over the equator and mostly over the oceans, with a major exception being when that moisture enters the Amazon basin and it recycles 5 or 6 times as it goes from the Atlantic to the Andes. And this will show a model that makes it a little more obvious because you're not looking at anything other than South America. But the interesting thing is, yes, the Amazon makes half of its own rainfall, but it also provides important moisture outside the Amazon, in particular to the agricultural belt of Brazil, south of the Amazon basin. More recently, we've been seeing unprecedented droughts, 2005, 2010, again in 2016. I think it's because there is a combined synergistic effect between deforestation, widespread use of fire, and actual climate change. And South America's leading climate scientist, Carlos Nobre, and I have concluded that there is a tipping point close at hand, that these are probably the first flickers indicating that, and that if we have any brains, we'll find a way to do some reforestation in the Amazon and build back a margin of safety. And of course, there's a huge amount of biodiversity tied up in all of that, a huge amount of carbon that could end up in the atmosphere and make climate change even worse. And so Mary Evelyn thought it would be really important for me to give you a little taste of what this is like actually when you're on the ground. So, and I'm going to need your help again. So, this is a 3-minute video that a student produced in a storytelling group. Great, thanks. How do we actually protect the biology of the living planet so that it's there hundreds and thousands of years from now? Let's stop thinking about nature as some little patch of protected area in the middle of a human-dominated system. Let's start thinking about human aspiration embedded in natural landscapes. So we're at Camp 41, which is, to my mind, the best of the research camps we have here in the heart of the Amazon. And that's because it's virtually unbroken forest from here all the way to the Amazon, essentially the forest primeval. Biological diversity is a priority in how I look at the whole picture. It's incontrovertibly led to a priority in protecting large areas and connecting small areas that are now isolated. And just to sum it up with a single example from this project, 100 hectares of forest, if it's a fragment, it loses half of the species of the birds of the forest in less than 15 years. So you may have a forest, but it doesn't have all the things that it had originally. So what this means is that you want to have all that diversity in the Amazon basin, you actually need to manage it as a system so that it can generate the rainfall that's essential to have a rainforest. Moisture gets returned to the moving air mass through evaporation off the complex surfaces of the forest and through the action of transpiration through the leaves. That process repeats itself 5 or 6 times. So finally it gets to the high wall of the Andes and the air mass moves up. And most of that moisture drops out in a tremendous amount of rain and creates essentially the 20% of the world's river water that is the Amazon system. But it's not just about science here, it's also about building the next generation of scientists. There's no better classroom than the reality of being in the heart of the living planet. And they get it. Here we are. So can we get back in? So the amazing thing about that video was I didn't have a script. That student took various things I said and stitched them together and made the script. It's great. So, so now sort of beginning to head towards what can we do about all of this? Because there's no point in waving your hands about a problem without a solution. We have to look at all the elements of change that are going on, and the other big system change is the acidification of the oceans, not recognized until 2005. We all sort of ignored basic high school chemistry, that some of that excess CO2 in the atmosphere would become carbonic acid. Why worry about that? Because there are hundreds of thousands of species that build shells or skeletons out of calcium carbonate, and that is pH dependent. Some of them we know about, others are less familiar, and let's see if we can get this to actually move. Well, maybe not. So that is a tiny little organism. It's a tiny little snail that exists in untold numbers in the North Atlantic, off of Alaska, and it's basically the base of the food chain, and it is very vulnerable to ocean acidification. First indication that there was an issue was when somebody collected some and kept them overnight in a small container of seawater on a ship, and the next morning their shells were etched from the acidification from their own CO2 being exhaled into the water. So the point here is that basically we're dealing with, at this point, aspects of how the Earth system works that we really don't understand. It just makes very little sense to keep proceeding in the direction we're going and find out how some of those things might or might not work. So what can we do about all of this? First of all, we need to think about where we stop. And some of these images date from when everybody was thinking 2 degrees is where we should stop. Actually, at 2 degrees, you would have a whole series of consequences around ice, but a whole series around ecosystems. And if you want one soundbite, why 2 degrees is too much, it's that the last time the planet was 2 degrees warmer, the oceans were 4 to 6 meters higher. It would not be good for New Haven, among other places, right? So for a long time, those of us who'd sort of been looking at the biology of the planet had serious reservations about 2 degrees. At the Paris climate meeting, when finally the possibility of less began to reappear, interestingly enough, because island nations were speaking up, and suddenly people were thinking, well, when did anybody say it was an okay thing to let an entire nation state disappear under the waves? I mean, it was like it had been totally ignored, when at the same time all the big country coastlines were going to be vulnerable to the same sea level rise. So we've heard recently from the Intergovernmental Panel about 1.5 degrees. The particular point that Lee Hanna and I make in the new book is that you have to keep it lower than 1.5 degrees if you want to have a biologically manageable planet, because it'll all start coming apart in ways that it's very hard to predict. So what are some of the things you can do about this? Let's go back for a minute. So I like to call this guy Dr. Planet, and he's made the diagnosis. Now he's trying to figure out what to prescribe. And there's some obvious conservation strategies you might get into, and then you have to worry a lot about the CO2 in the atmosphere. So revising conservation strategies, there are obvious things, putting natural connections back into the landscape, the kind of thing we talked about last week. Minimizing other stresses on these ecosystems obviously helps avoid synergies. You can think, at least in the shorter term, about building up natural systems to the way they used to function. Here, South Florida, that would resist a certain amount of storm surge. There obviously is a gigantic energy agenda, and we're not changing rapidly enough on the energy base of society at all. I mean, that's, I think, terribly obvious. But one part of this, long ignored, is how the biology of the planet has been playing into this whole climate change picture. And you sort of hear sort of tangentially mentioned the role of forests in all of this. The actual annual emissions of forests is quite significant. And depending whether you look at the gross amount emitted or the net amount emitted, it's between 10 and 30% of annual emissions. So the question is there something that we could do to play with this annual equation of the emissions from forest destruction, about 5 times as much from basically old systems, which is what fossil fuels are, and half going into the atmosphere and the other half essentially dividing between land and the oceans. Might we even be able to turn one of those arrows in the other direction? And it's important to do because greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for a very long time. So one of the really important questions that biology can help us with is, are there ways that we can use natural systems to lower the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and therefore the amount of climate change? So essentially, there are 2 things you can do. You can restore natural ecosystems with lots of side benefits. It won't be enough, so we need to think really hard in developing ways we can do it, not biologically, but interestingly, if you look at the history of the planet, there were 2 times when there were literally screamingly high levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. And on both occasions, natural processes brought it down to pre-industrial levels. Pretty impressive what the planet can do. But that takes tens of millions of years, and we don't have that luxury. As of January, we got new numbers about the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere from destruction of ecosystems. It was larger than anybody had realized before, essentially equal to what remains in living ecosystems. And that means restoring ecosystems can literally take tens of parts per million out of the atmosphere. To give you a framework, the pre-industrial level was 280 parts per million. We'd like to stop at 350, but that's, rear view mirror because we're already at 401. But if you took 30 parts per million out of the atmosphere, suddenly you'd be at 370. So these are substantial numbers. And I'm really delighted to have tonight to show to you pre-publication some maps about the carbon potential of ecosystem restoration produced at the Woods Hole Research Center. And Xander Nasikas right there worked very hard in that program. And you can see actually that it's a very impressive possibility. So what about soil carbon? This gives you a sense of how much carbon has been removed by agriculture and other human activities. It is a substantial number. And the flip side of it is you restore carbon to the soil, you get more fertile soil, better ecosystems, better agriculture. So this shows current carbon storage. Get this right here. And the scale is in millions of grams of carbon per hectare, so it adds up quickly is the point. So this is the current carbon storage above ground. This is potential carbon storage. And that's how much has been unrealized. So there's a lot that can be done based on that kind of map. So we're not going to reforest Manhattan or London or parts of Rio de Janeiro, but there are lots of parts of the world where we could actually benefit in additional ways than just carbon reduction by doing this ecosystem restoration. So, so one big piece of it is how we manage forests. And it doesn't mean you can't get some economic productivity out of forests, but it's important to keep an eye on the carbon balance. And there are all these degraded grasslands around the world. What do you get when you restore degraded grasslands and grasslands and grazing lands? You actually get better grazing. That could be cattle, or it could be native species. And then we really have to modify agriculture and stop it from leaking carbon and start managing it in ways that restores carbon, builds up carbon, and increases soil fertility. So there's so many reasons to be doing these kinds of things anyway that there's sort of this double incentive. It's good in terms of ecosystem benefits. It's also very good in terms of climate benefits. And more recently, attention has been focused on what's called blue carbon, things along coastlines. My main illustration here are mangroves, which turn out to be very mangrove dense. That's the natural distribution of mangroves around the world. Here's some statistics about them. So basically, it would make sense to leave mangroves standing from a carbon point of view. Well, there are other reasons to do it too. And Pavan Sukhdev did this analysis some years ago, actually. The question was, what is the economics of clearing mangroves for shrimp farms? And if you just look at it on the surface in a superficial way, of course you'd clear the mangroves to do the shrimp farms. If you then look at the actual numbers without the subsidies, in this particular case, it's a much less compelling case. And then if you look at it in terms of the ecosystem services, actually without the carbon benefit, you would never do it at all. So if you add a third or a fourth analysis there, which I don't have, it becomes an overwhelming case to do the shrimp farming other places. There's no reason they actually have to be in mangrove coastal regions. And then woven into this is the whole food and land use trajectory as human population soars. And there have been really good scholars who've looked at all of this and determined that you can actually feed all the coming billions of people an adequate diet without destroying another square inch of nature. And that involves improving agricultural practices in places where productivity is low. It includes eliminating food waste. There's like 30 to 40% of all food is wasted. World Wildlife Fund US now has a food waste program. Even, a buffet practice in a hotel or a cruise ship has to change the psychology of the passengers so they don't have lots of food left over, because passengers seem to like to come to the buffet even if they're at the very end and just see a whole array of choices. And they're working on ways to do that. And so this sort of gives that whole picture of what ecosystem restoration can do. And I think the wonderful thing about it is that it allows us to restore the functionality of this planet in a way that's a benefit to human beings and other forms of life. As Arrhenius would have said, making it habitable for other humans and other forms of life. Thank you very much.
We have microphones be.
No, they're recording.
Could you give us your thoughts on what is going on in Brazil? And we talk about population. I understand the new leader has his regard toward women. It sounds like he just sees them as vessels for reproduction, and I'm wondering how you feel about, what hope you see for Brazil.
I'm not surprised I got that question. I've spent at least half of the last 3 days trying to get a better trajectory there. So basically, the new president of Brazil came in because the people were fed up with crime in the streets, fed up with corruption, and fed up with a miserable economy that the Workers' Party had gotten everything into. But then there's all this other language and baggage. And we'll see how it plays out, but not in a way of just sitting on our hands. So, he has proposed merging the agriculture ministry with the environment ministry. And all the living ministers of the environment signed a letter encouraging him to think differently, to put it politely. And he agreed that he wouldn't do that. And then on Tuesday, his essentially future chief of staff said, "Oh, we're going to do it anyway." Right? Well, then yesterday they said, "Well, this is not a done deal." And then, interestingly, the agriculturalists decided they didn't like this idea. Rather than sort of seeing it as an opportunity where they might run roughshod over the environment interests, they thought, "Oh, we'll never get anywhere." So we'll just have to see, It'll be a day by day, and who talks to who at particular places, and, it's just life. You have to deal with it. So.
And just a reminder that after the talk, we'll be having a reception just at the end of the hall, so I hope you'll stay and join us.
Yeah, and it's tasty biodiversity, I can tell you.
Don't want any food to go to waste.
Hi, do you feel like adding a CO2 emissions tax would be a good way to force the world into reducing emissions?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that a tax on carbon is the simplest and most efficient way to make a really serious dent. And there are really interesting questions about what you could do with that revenue, including the simplistic one of simply giving it back, to the American public as a rebate of some sort. And so that idea, essentially, I believe, was first proposed by my classmate, Bill Nordhaus. And that's at least a large part of the reason he recently was awarded the Nobel Prize.
Tom, I've heard you talk a lot over a number of years about the need to manage the Amazon as a system, as one unit, but there are 9 countries that control and manage the Amazon, oftentimes with their own agenda. And with increasing nationalism in the region, what is your perspective for moving towards that goal?
Well, that's a really good question. Very good question. So, you saw the hydrological cycle of the Amazon. It basically means if you want to maintain the Amazon and also the moisture it feeds south of Brazil, you have to manage it as a system, because that's how it works. And there are 9 countries, and one of them is in a real mess at the moment, Venezuela. But there is an Amazon Cooperation Treaty, which has had little flickers of effectiveness in the past, particularly when Fernando Henrique Cardoso was president of Brazil. And we had a good dinner, and he got it, right? So it's not simple, but I think there is growing recognition in a lot of these countries that they actually have to find ways to collaborate. And on the 20th of November, the Brazilian ambassador is having a lunch with the ambassador of Ecuador, the ambassador of Peru, and since the ambassador of Colombia is away, the deputy chief of mission, and yours truly. And the Inter-American Development Bank also understands the need to try and move in this kind of direction. So at the same time as you're getting these deeply distracting headlines about the new government in Brazil, you have a mainstream of people who recognize the need to do something. And interestingly, if you poll Brazilians, 70% will say you have to protect the Amazon because they get it.
Dr. Lovejoy, my name is Mark. I have a question about carbon pricing. I read an op-ed in LA Times about 2-3 days ago, basically saying that Dr. Norhaus' scheme actually is slowing down the effort to try to reduce global warming because the price may be mispriced. Do you have any opinion as to what should be a price that
you know,
is doable?
the details of what the price should be are always going to be a matter for debate. But the idea is fundamentally sound.
Tom, it's always inspiring to hear you talk, so I just wanted to say that. But also, can you give us your take on the geoengineering proposals to try to reduce solar radiation and this way mitigate?
Well, that's one of my favorite subjects, and it's also in the book. So, geoengineering proposals are proposals to do things at the planetary scale to deal with not climate change, but the effects of climate change. So an example would be to mimic what volcanoes do naturally, occasionally, in a spotty way, and put a lot of sulfur up in the atmosphere and reduce the amount of radiation coming in. Well, first of all, that does nothing for acidification of the oceans, right? Just a temperature thing. Second of all, the minute you do something like that, there may be downsides to it. And whatever is global in scale, the downside will be global in scale too. And thirdly, for that kind of a thing, the minute you stop doing it, for whatever reason, you go right back to the temperature you would have been at if nothing had ever been done. So I think we need to be really thoughtful about geoengineering because you really have to include the oceans in how you think about all of this. And I think basically the best solution is to let's get back to the point where you have a planet that functions in the kind of way that protects that stable climate.
With the reports that came out this week about the 60% decline in wildlife species around the world, I was hearing some talk on different radio programs about the need for a level similar to the climate change conventions on protecting wildlife and not furthering species loss. I guess with the upcoming UN conference in Egypt, I believe, on biodiversity, do you have any hopes for what might come out of that, if any?
So just for those who don't know all the pieces, there are 3 environment conventions that came out of the Earth Summit in Rio. One is about the climate, and you read about that to a fairly well. And if I would criticize it over time, it was that it was too dominated by Physical scientists and biological scientists have only recently been able to get some purchase, and that had a lot to do with the recent 1.5 degree report they put out. Biodiversity Convention has sort of been in the shadows, and it could have been more effective in the way it conducted its business. I don't want to spend time looking back at that. In 2020, it will have a conference of the parties in Beijing, and it will set the targets for the subsequent decade. Not having met the targets in the decade that will be closing at that point. And a lot of us are worried that the targets will be too timid because of that fear of failure, when it really, in many ways, will be the last decade of opportunity to really make major gains. That's why I went to Beijing about 4 weeks ago. And so there's some serious discussion going over there, and I got appointed on the International Advisory Committee for the Chinese. We'll see what that turns into. But that's really important, and it will be meeting as a conference literally 2 weeks from now in Egypt. I can't go for that because the book's being released in New York. But there's a lot of serious discussion going on, trying to come up with a doable but ambitious outcome.
So I want to invite you all to join us at the reception at the end of the hall. I want to say thank you and congratulations.
Thank you.
I want to say thanks to the Terry Lectures for bringing Tom to...